So, has Boris Johnson finally thrown Brexiteers under a bus? Boris Johnson has come under mounting pressure to change direction on a no deal and engage with the EU to hammer out a deal before the UK leaves the transition period at the end of the year. Boris had all but given up on getting a deal with the EU, but businesses in the UK started to see what a post-Brexit Britain would actually look like. They began to heap pressure on the Tories, who in turn instructed Boris and his government to change tact. Evidence for this comes from an unlikely source, the EU. The European Commissioner for Trade has told UK media that British negotiators in the talks on trade and security have begun engaging with the most contentious issues in the last number of weeks. Phil Hogan, who is managing the EU's negotiations, explained that he has seen a change in attitude from Downing Street in the month of July as the penny finally dropped that time was running out, but that the discussions were not as advanced as they would like. He said that both sides, the UK and the EU, have been engaging in intense negotiations for months, and that informal discussions had continued this week. Aside from access to British waters for European fishing fleets and new rules to prevent regulatory undercutting, which are actually being discussed, many other issues remain to be dealt with, and there is still the time required for all of this to be ratified in Parliament. He went on to say that 5 or 6 major issues are potentially blocking a deal, with the one of state aid being the most pressing. Now, Number 10 has so far refused to publish details of the subsidiary control regime it would like to implement after the UK leaves the transition period. This has made officials in the EU nervous because it would leave very little time to actually look at them in detail before they would sign off on them. Boris Johnson could be playing a game here, but it's not clear if he's trying to trick the EU or the British public. The British team of negotiators say that it's not necessary for the EU to see this new regime, as domestic legislation isn't relevant to Brussels. But the EU has said it could respond in kind if the British government didn't accept the so-called level playing field, and in turn gave exemptions from its own rules and allowed member states to subsidise European companies competing with British businesses. This basically means that the EU would prefer to agree a level playing field with the UK, but if the British government attempts dirty tricks over state aid, the EU would step in and support European companies too, in a sense levelling the playing field. This could escalate into a tit-for-tat between a smaller economy and a larger trading bloc. Who do you think would eventually win out in that scenario? Commissioner Hogan also said that negotiations over the last 3 months weren't meaningful, but in the last few weeks that they have changed, and he welcomed that. He said that British businesses have become more and more vocal recently, both publicly and privately, and that seems to have been reflected in the level of engagement taking place on the UK side of the negotiations. The UK has promised to deliver the details of its rules surrounding state aid, but since the negotiations started, nothing has been published. The EU has been saying that they can't sign up to a deal unless it's clear what the UK's approach to certain mechanisms is going forward. Away from the EU for a moment, the UK hopes to have an agreement with Japan to be announced in the next number of weeks. Now, it's expected to copy some of the current agreements with the EU, but government officials have conceded this UK-Japanese deal will be much less ambitious than previously thought. After the EU, the UK really wants to sign a massive trade deal with the US, and leading Brexiteers have been pumping this one up. But it looks likely, due to US demands to lower standards, something British businesses are actually against, officials once again have conceded that it will not be signed, at least this year. If Joe Biden were to win in November, this would complicate matters even more. Remember when Barack Obama said that post-Brexit, the UK will be at the back of the queue. Commissioner Hogan also said, when commenting on the negotiating positions, that there was never any advantage to be gained by negotiating from a position of weakness outside the EU. Just to return for a moment on the US demands for lower standards, the EU believes, perhaps rightly, that the UK public would not have the stomach to support the importation of chlorinated chicken and hormone-treated beef, but we'll have to wait and see the results of that. The rhetoric from the UK negotiating team has been that they have been slowed until recently because of foot dragging by the EU, but Brussels has been clear about their position since the beginning. It has been Boris Johnson's government that has been trying to play mind games with the media, the opposition, and finally the British people. If British businesses have managed to convince Boris Johnson to steer away from the iceberg that is crashing out of the transition period without a deal, then we should see this as something extremely positive. The UK had always hoped to run down the clock with the idea that this would force the EU to compromise. But considering the pressure that's been applied to the government from without, it may be Boris Johnson who finally compromises in order to save the Conservative Party. Maybe Brexiteers will find themselves with Theresa May and the DUP under a big red bus. Let me know in the comments section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. Why not become a Patreon and enjoy access to our Discord server where we share news, chat, and have some fun? If you become a patron, you can also make video suggestions on topics that are important to you. Check it out via the link in the description.